Good morning, comrades. You were listening to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. This show is Good Morning, Comrade. Jeff and Scott from the crew here today. We also have Ben Burgis, returning champion. He is. You're at the University of Georgia at Athens. Is that what is it?
No, I'm at Georgia State University.
Georgia State,
so the campus that I teach at is Perimeter College, which is affiliated with GSU. So I'm at a campus in like the kind of near northern suburbs of Atlanta.
Yeah, sorry I bungled that one. But anyway,
no worries.
It's great to have you back, Ben.
It's all online now anyway.
Yeah, well, lucky for you, it's online, because I know you were very concerned about the situation. Maybe we can get into that first.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about on this show, and I've been doing a lot of sort of work around not returning to school in an unsafe environment. I myself am a grade school teacher. I teach 4th and 5th grade special education, and there's been a lot of energy behind making sure that we go 100% virtual. And I guess so. You've gotten to that point. How is that did that sort of work out with your college and your situation?
Yeah, so they originally went online, right after spring break, basically. They were really dragging their feet on it, and it's Georgia, so it's not unionized, which obviously makes a difference.
Not yet.
Not yet. No, that's true. Actually, there is actually a union affiliated with the CWA that's trying to organize the campus, but it's early days yet, right? So there's certainly no like collective bargaining process set up. But I joined. If anybody is listening to this who works for Georgia State University, maybe we could put a link to the union membership form in the show notes or something.
Sure.
But in any case, because there's no collective bargaining process set up or anything, plus it's in Georgia, so our governor, Brian Kemp, is a lunatic. He literally claimed in like April, I think, that he'd only just the day before found out that viruses can spread asymptomatically. Like his story is that he didn't know that.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
This guy's in charge of an entire state.
Yeah. And also his office is like 20 minutes away from the national headquarters of the CDC. So if he really wanted to find this out, I'll bet he could find somebody to explain it to him. But yeah, so at Georgia reopened so early that even Trump criticized them for it at the time. It's just insane and bizarre. So of course there's all kinds of political pressure on the university system there to go back face to face. And right now they're still claiming they're going to do it. The official plan, like originally it was going to be like if you taught a Monday, Wednesday class, half the class would show up on Monday and half the class would show up on a Wednesday. And then a bunch of everybody's learning would be online. That was supposed to be the compromise, so that there'd be fewer people there. Then they kind of had to admit that even with only half capacity, there were still a lot of those classrooms where it just wouldn't be physically possible to seat everybody 6 feet apart.
Right.
So the new plan is that every student is going to come to each class once every 2 weeks. So it's going to be like a quarter of the class every time. And we'll see how long that lasts. I strongly suspect that like within 2 weeks, the whole thing will be back online after the semester started. There have been other universities that have been in that situation. But meanwhile, all I could say is that because the CDC guidelines have a BMI threshold in them, so never have I been so happy to have to lose some weight, because I officially qualify, for the for one of the high risk categories. It's like,
well, congratulations
it's like
to you.
Yeah, it's like going to the family doctor to come up with a note so you don't have to go to Vietnam.
Right. Yeah, that's your bone spurs.
That's right. That's my bone spurs.
It is pretty bizarre, like going to school in like national disasters like this, because like my senior year was the year Katrina hit, and like I had a lot of like going to different schools and like coming back to home and like dealing with a bunch of like trailer learning and stuff.
Yeah, he graduated from the one and only St. Bernard Unified School, where they just consolidated every single school in our parish. We were from the same place, like right outside of New Orleans, and they just took all the schools and just slammed them into one mega school.
Yeah, they were just like passing out degrees, like we needed to make look good.
Well, I'm glad that you're in a better teaching situation and it's gonna be much safer. Yeah, it really is wild how there's this constant sort of obsession, I would say, to just pretend that this like pandemic isn't happening or it's a minor inconvenience, and it's really makes you feel like you're the crazy one. Like if you're not talking to other people who agree with you, like it could just I can see how it would be a way to just sort of spellbound you and make you feel like you're on an island when there's so much of this. I mean, I don't want to use the word gaslighting, but it certainly feels like it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it's a overused word in political context, but God, the denial of like obvious reality is severe with this stuff. Like, especially, like, I don't know, the idea that it would even be possible to teach in a safe way, like under these circumstances, is just beyond bizarre. Like nobody's ever supposed to walk up next to you. You're, of course, you're in a classroom, so it's enclosed air. Mm-hmm. I actually had a friend who teaches at a college in New York, who like his college, like upstate, and his college finally did relent, at the last minute, but for a while they were like talking about like, okay, maybe we can like teach under a tarp outside, like to make this work. It's like, Jesus, guys, just don't.
I keep seeing these classrooms in like on Facebook pictures or in articles and all these things with plexiglass like around the kid's desk, and like the teacher standing behind plexiglass, and having that be the sort of situation where like elementary school educators are expected to teach, and it's just sort of like, why are we doing this? I mean, like go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's a couple levels more insane too, because I mean, the best meme I saw about this was like, not only is it like a sign that you've never interacted with children if you think they're going to follow social distancing guidelines, but it's a sign that you've never interacted with children if you don't think that they're going to lick their hands and run around chasing each other saying Corona.
Yeah, you got it. And just to sort of like put a bow on this point, like when you and Adam had a discussion about this on your show, the Dead Pundit Society, and I was listening to that, and I thought he made a really good point, and I've been telling this to people as well, that when like the idea of working from home is more like living at work. I think it was either you or he made that.
I think that was Adam, but yeah, it's exactly right.
And I'm in the situation where I choose that. I choose to live at work rather than go. Like, if that's possible, I will like go out and I will like be a part of a rally at the administration building to say, make my life miserable that way instead of make my life miserable in the way that I can like continue to spread this pandemic and possibly infect my family and the children as well. It's
I mean, look, working from home, right, is certainly no treat. Actually, one of the first Jacobin pieces I wrote after the lockdown was about the kind of amping up of employer surveillance, essentially, after so many white collar workers were sent home, that people would make their employees load up their computers with spyware to make sure they were really working the whole time. Just do insane things like demand that employees like log into a Zoom meeting and just stay logged in all day so they can be monitored. So obviously, there are some, there's definitely some issues there.
Oh yeah,
but it's still, and nobody should take any of that stuff lying down.
No,
but it's still better than actually being asked to go into work in a plague zone.
Yeah, totally. I wanted to get into some of basically a recent interview on your new show, what you just started releasing. You now have a podcast called Give Them an Argument, which is the same name as your book, Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. And you can essentially, you had a really great interview about with Michael Powell, who is he's a New York Times writer. And you and he talked about an article that he wrote about Adolph Reed and what happened with him and the New York City DSA. Can you just sort of run down a little bit of that?
Yeah. So obviously, DSA is the largest socialist organization in the country. So Adolph Reed has been a pretty prominent socialist scholar for decades, right? He's a Black Marxist academic. He's written a lot about the history of both the movement against segregation, in the first part of the 20th century. I mean, he grew up in New Orleans in that era.
We've met. We've met. He's actually done a couple events. He's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, he has a really good article. Blanket on the title, but I liked it a lot. That was written a few years ago about the efforts to take down Confederate statues. In New Orleans. That anyway, I'd really recommend that people check that out. But
yeah, I'd like to read more about that.
Yeah. Well, he goes through in the article, like most of it is kind of going through the history of how the statues first came up and kind of demolishing the rationalizations that people make to keep them up, and really demonstrating that this was not this wasn't about like, I don't know, like families of Confederate war dead remembering them or anything like that, right? Like this was like a much later statement, right? Like a white supremacist anti-civil rights gesture, putting up these statues in the first place. Okay, yeah, it's called monumental rubbish.
Yeah,
I mean, that just shows a lot of these people. They were like, well, if I just put this big brass statue there, or if I put it really, really high, they'll never be able to take it down. And if that's why they can't take it down, I'll just be like, because you can't do nothing about it.
Yeah.
And then they started being able to do something about it, and everybody's like, wait, no.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So it's a really nice essay because he both goes through all this history, explains why they should be taken down, but he also does what he's very good at, which is kind of taking, sort of taking the discussion from the realm of the symbolic issues to sort of bigger underlying issues, right? He talks, even though it's not really what the essay is about, right? He talks in there about like how obviously we shouldn't have, the statues of 19th century supervillains, but if you really want to do something to address to address like unequal, inequality, that afflicts, Black people in New Orleans, like really like unionizing the hospitality industry and, things like this, would be the way to go. Right. And that essay, I think for anybody who's never read any Adolph Reed, right, that'd be like a really good entry point. But he's written stuff like this for a very long time. Cornel West, in the Michael Powell article in the New York Times, Cornel West is quoted calling him the, something like the greatest democratic theorist, of the last few decades. So this is a guy who's this kind of like, monster of, socialist scholarship, so of course it makes perfect sense that he would be invited to speak at a DSA meeting. And the particular thing he was going to talk about in this event, right, it was going to be on Zoom, of course, because of the pandemic, was going to be the coronavirus and the way that it's and the racial disparities in coronavirus deaths. And the core point that he was making, there, he was going to make in his talk, but he had a Common Dreams article about this you could read, where he makes the argument there that he was going to make in the talk, is that we've been talking about these racial disparities in the coronavirus deaths in the wrong way, and the thing that he objects to is too many people not really making the link between the disparities and poverty. In other words, the suggestion sometimes people say, we really need to look at, why this is killing, so many more black people than white people, where the implication is almost that maybe there's some genetic explanation or something like that. And his point is, of course, okay, this is absurd. This is actually really dangerous because this is a sort of way to, it's almost like race science, right? Because if you believe, which you should, that race is a largely made up category, right? That in biological terms, it's more or less meaningless, right? You can have some clusters of genetic propensities for some things that may be sometimes roughly aligned with what we call race, but by and large, this is a way of sorting people that has much more to do with historical systems of oppression than anything that has anything to do with genetics or biology. The genetic differences among so-called races are much greater than between them. And which, again, this is pretty just basic, about science and you're not a racist stuff.
Right.
That part shouldn't be controversial. But his point is, that he objects to what he calls disparity ideology, both because that it can lead to this kind of racialized view about medicine that's could be bad and reactionary and scientifically unhelpful, and also because it misses the real point, right? The reason that black people are so much more likely than white people to die of the coronavirus is that black people are so much more likely to live in poverty than white people because of the historical effects of slavery and Jim Crow and FHA redlining and all that stuff. And realizing that is actually politically important because the takeaway is different, right? In other words, instead of saying okay, we have this racially specific problem and we need to look for some sort of racially targeted solution, he said, no, the problem is poverty. And of course, because of America's history of de jure racial apartheid, that falls much more heavily on black people than white people, but the poverty is the problem, right? That's the actual issue that you need to address.
Right. They're not more biologically predisposed to poverty; they're socially predisposed to poverty because of the racial historical context that existed.
Exactly,
and that led to the point.
Yeah, totally right. And so once you realize that, right, that the solution, what you need to do to look for ways to solve this problem is to find ways to get poor black people and poor white people and poor people of other backgrounds to unite to try to do something, to about economic inequality. Right, That's the actual issue.
It's a class situation that cuts across race, and part of the critique that sort of leads to what happened with DSA, which we'll get to in just one moment. There's a sort of an effort to sort of call that kind of thinking race reductionist. 1 second, really quick, so I pause for station ID. You're listening to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. Jeff and Scott with Ben Burgis. We're talking about Adolph Reed's sort of perspective on race, and we're about to get onto the idea of class reductionism, or the sort of epithet of that being thrown at people who think in terms of working across these races or these differences that are like we were just saying, socially constructed, which doesn't mean nothing. It doesn't mean that is meaningless. It's very significant in the perspective that this is how people have been sort of socialized, and how sort of wealth has sort of been distributed over multiple generations. And so we were going to get into what is a class reductionist exactly, and why do people think that that's bad?
Yeah. So to bring it back to Reed, the long and short of it is that this talk that he was supposed to give to DSA was canceled, and there's some he said she said about the details that get tedious. But I think that what everybody could agree on is that it was canceled in a context where there was enough controversy, there's enough opposition to doing this talk at this time, that it had kind of become toxic, right?
Yeah.
So the talk itself was supposed to be co-sponsored by the Lower Manhattan and Philadelphia branches of DSA, and it had at one time been promoted by New York City DSA as a whole, and then the leadership body of New York City DSA kind of took a vote and disassociated itself from the event. And there was some concern, this was months ago when people weren't as good at figuring out how to use Zoom as they are now.
Right.
Everybody had a lot less practice. There was concern about like Zoom bombing. That there would be people who'd be disruptive.
Is that kind of a bomb threat?
What's that?
Is that kind of a bomb threat?
Yeah. So eventually, Reed and the remaining organizers just kind of decided, that's like, all right, this is just not worth it.
Yeah,
right?
juice isn't worth the squeeze here.
And what the Michael Powell article in the New York Times, which I thought was very good, is about, and what I think is most interesting, beyond the kind of particulars of like the lead up to the cancellation of this talk, is beyond a sort of larger issue that you could raise that I think we should also, is also important, right? About like having a sort of culture of hashing out internal differences in the left in this kind of hyper moralized and unhelpful way, right? So that's also an issue. But the main thing here is the underlying charge against Reed, which was that he's being a class reductionist. Now, if we're going to play this game, I think that there's something very ironic about a black man who grew up in the Jim Crow South being accused by, let's be honest, mostly white people of not understanding that race is important. That's an odd.
It's a bit rich.
That's an odd development, right? But I think that rather than sort of just dismiss it that way, it's also important to get into like the underlying issue, right? Like, okay, sure. So that would be odd and ironic, but who knows? Maybe they're right? Are they? So class reductionism it's a little bit vague, but like when people throw around this accusation, the charge seems to be that you only care about economics, or you think the left should only care about economics, and you're kind of dismissive of, or you tend to downplay the importance of everything else, right? By
the way, I've never seen Reed do that. I've never actually seen an instance of that being the case.
No, I've absolutely never seen him do that. In fact, if you read his article about this topic in the New Republic, Myth of Class Reductionism, he's at pains to say, yeah, racism and sexism and homophobia and all these things certainly persist and they certainly cause harm, right? That's what I'm saying is not to deny that, right? Like that should just go without saying. What he is saying, and what other people, often other, Black socialist scholars with a similar perspective, Cedric Johnson, Walter Ben Michaels, a few other people who have a similar critique, is that it's a mistake to think about this stuff as if there's this like social force called like race and the social force called gender, and then there's class, and these are all basically separate things that just sort of intersect as they bump into each other, which is the way that a lot of people on the left think about it. Instead, sticking with the race example, both because that's the original context and because that's like probably a good thing to stand in for everything else, just because it's so like profoundly important to American history. I think that the way to think about it instead is that, of course, as socialists, we want equal civic and legal rights for everybody as a foundation, right? Before we even get into everything else. And certainly if people in positions of power are acting on the basis of racial bias, that violates that, and we should care about that, right? Of course. But what you're oftentimes when people use phrases like structural racism or systemic racism, what they're really identifying is the way that the economic structure, the way that capitalism, in effect, I'm sure Reed would use much classier metaphors than this, but the analogy that always comes to my mind is it's like the mosquito at the beginning of Jurassic Park, that's like trapped in, amber from the Jurassic, that capitalism essentially freezes these distributive patterns as if they were in amber, right? Because if you sort of say, okay, we're going to have, slavery, we're going to have Jim Crow, we're going to have redlining, and then we'll end all that. But then, like, the second that's over, let the chips fall where they may, right? Like just let the free market shake out however it's going to.
Everything is equal now. We have the vaunted equality of opportunity, or whatever that they like to say, or whatever that is. And now everything is actually a meritocracy. And it's measured by where people are at the end of the day.
Right. And of course, where people are at the beginning of the day is going to be very different because of these historical injustices and the distribution of poverty, which has obviously been wildly unequally distributed, between white people and black people since emancipation, is obviously a reflection of that. But there are two things here, right? So one is what would actually be a good strategy for doing anything about this, right? And the other is what would count as a win, right? What should we accept? And all of these things have to do with understanding that that what we're talking about, right? So the primary reason why there's so many, there's such a higher proportion of black people than white people living in poverty is not because of ongoing racial bias. That doesn't mean, of course, racial bias isn't ongoing. It certainly is. But that's not the primary cause, right? In other words, like the primary cause of this income gap, between white people and black people is not stuff like hiring discrimination, for example, right? Which is not to deny that hiring discrimination goes on, right? But it's not the main cause. The main cause is that people are in wildly different starting points because of the historical legacy of these other things, right? So now the question is, what are you going to do about it? And the perspective that people like Reed have, which is also the perspective of a lot of figures, many of whom were socialists in the civil rights movement, people like King, like Bayard Rustin, like A. Philip Randolph, is that, all right, we've got this problem of black poverty that comes about as a result of these historical processes, right? And now, what are we going to do about it? Well, one thing you could do would, for example, to be focused on demand for like racially targeted reparations, but it's going to be very hard to put together like a winning coalition for that, right? Not people saying some of the right words in a Democratic primary for the sake of pandering, but like a winning coalition to make it actually happen.
And there is a question also as well about that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but there's a question
go for
also
it.
in terms of but in terms of giving a lump reparations sum to people that have been affected, that does nothing to overturn the economic system that currently exists. It sort of takes for granted that it's not going to change, and just sort of like dispersing money to people based off of previously faced harms doesn't overturn that at all. It actually kind of reaffirms.
No, it doesn't. And in fact, like the internal logic of the demand in a weird way is kind of accepts the basic legitimacy of having a society where wealth and power are distributed this way. In other words, like it kind of frames so many black people living in poverty as like as if that's an unacceptable deviation from a basically acceptable pattern, right? And this is the second point I was going to get to, which is what would count as a win. In other words, let's imagine that I have no idea how this would happen without massive redistribution of wealth, right? But like, let's imagine that we somehow did get, reparations or some other racially targeted program that was somehow enough to correct these imbalances.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And let's just ignore, for the sake of the thought experiment, all the obvious like political problems with how that would come about. So now imagine that exactly the right proportions of white people and black people for their portions in the general population were living in miserable, grinding poverty, being subject to the kind of aggressive militarized policing that poor neighborhoods in general tend to be subject to, being forced to work during a plague as essential workers, all that stuff. Would we accept that as a just outcome?
Mm-hmm.
Like if it were even possible politically in the first place, which it's not, but if it were, right, would we think, okay, good enough, right? Clearly not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, like trying to do something just about black poverty is both politically probably not a very promising project, and also isn't something we would accept as a just outcome anyway, right? So I have a new article about this in a Substack project edited by Ryan Smith called The Third Rail.
Mm-hmm.
Just came out like literally minutes before we started recording. It's called The Quest for the Mythical Class Reductionist. And in it, right, the analogy that I use at the end, right, so I say, okay, well, like some of the reason that some people might object to what I'm saying here, right, that what we really need is to have a movement of poor and working people of all races that would, of course, take racial bias and combating it very seriously, but whose overall project was to bring about reforms and ultimately structural change that would target poverty and economic inequality in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
Part of the reason somebody might object to that would be that it is, of course, absolutely true. We should be real about this, that it's not that the fact that there is this racially uneven distribution of poverty is a result of slavery and Jim Crow and the rest of those things, right? It's not just random. It's not about individual decisions. It's not about culture or any of that nonsense, right? It's a result of these historical injustices. And so if you're saying, look, what we need to be targeting is just poverty per se, then some people might hear that and think, okay, well, you're kind of, but you're not really giving its due,
mm-hmm.
right? These like historically specific things. And the analogy, which I'm sure is clunky and silly in some ways, but but I hope gets across, the general idea is, imagine that there are 10 people who had all been kidnapped by a serial killer and they're being kept in his basement.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say this particular serial killer really, really hated Asian people. And so when possible, those were the people he targeted. And so because he had this bias, 5 of the 10 people in the serial killer's basement are Asian. Mm-hmm. Then there are also some white and black people in there too. Maybe like one of them was, he had to grab because like that guy was a witness. He saw him grabbing one of the others. Mm-hmm. Maybe a few of the others were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, right? So it's certainly true that it's not a coincidence that so many of the people in the basement are Asians, right? That's because of this thing that you should be absolutely real about. But also, nobody should be kept prisoner in a serial killer's basement. That's a bad situation for anybody. And also, right now, everybody who's in the basement, right, disproportionately Asians in this example, but everybody who's in the basement needs the same thing, which is to get out. And everybody's best chance of getting out is to work together with the other people who are trapped there. And I think that's how we should be thinking about poverty and economic inequality, that there are absolutely racially specific reasons why members of some groups are more likely to be there than members of other groups. But saying that everybody who's there needs the same thing to get out, and everybody who's there, their best shot of getting out is to work together on the basis of shared interests with everybody else who's in that situation, that's not reducing away all the other historical factors. That's not saying they don't matter. That's not saying that we should be in denial about them or downplay them, right? That's just like thinking strategically about how to get out of this horrible situation.
Yeah. You are listening to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade. We have Jeff and Scott in the studio with Ben Burgis. So yeah, that's really an interesting example. And I guess we can sort of like use that as an opportunity to sort of like change gears a little bit. I did want to talk a little bit about, we have had a previous conversation about making arguments in the past. And Scott, you had a question for Ben?
Oh, I'm sorry, what you said?
I don't remember.
Oh, okay. Well, so I guess we talked a little bit in the past about making arguments, and I messaged you as sort of a thing that came up to before the show. Is that one of the things I've noticed is that when you engage with someone else's argument, it is often helpful to sort of start to take a good version or a good faith version of that argument if you're choosing to engage. I'm not saying to engage in every single argument in the world, but when you do so, make sure that you're doing it with at least giving them some, credit for what they're saying and that they believe it, and then that gives you an opportunity to work from there, because you have a point of at least agreement on what the grounds are, even if the premises are not something that your conclusions, I suppose, are something that you can get to. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's been a general trend on parts of the left to dismiss certain disagreements and certain arguments. And also, by the way, like, I know you said this, but just to like underline it a couple times circle it, right? Put some stars next to it. Nothing that I'm saying here is a recommendation that everybody waste their valuable time engaging with like every single debate that anybody ever wants to have about anything.
Yeah, right? You don't have to argue with the white supremacists if you don't want to. Okay, it's fine.
Yeah. You don't have to argue with the white supremacist. You don't like there are lots of things that you can make reasonable choices about, like because like sometimes like I run into this, people are like, oh, hey, here you are saying give them an argument, and I'm like screaming at you and you're not engaging with me. What's up with that, bro? That's not really what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think it's absolutely legitimate. I say this in the book, to pick your battles, right?
Yes,
but when you are going to spend your time talking about something, right? Like, I think that there is a tendency that I think especially on maybe like the more recent and more kind of online, versions of the left, to be hyper focused on intentions and motives and who's saying what in good faith. And
you can never know that.
Yeah, right. It's very difficult to actually know that, right? Like maybe sometimes it's just obvious, but like very, very often it's not, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, I think most people probably, if you listen to this, if you've engaged in these things, you've probably been on both ends of this, right? Mm-hmm. You've probably had people attribute motives to you that you didn't have, right? As well as times that you've attributed bad motives to other people. And so the first thing is that it's very difficult to actually be sure, right? What's motivating somebody, whether they're actually operating quote unquote in good faith. But also, it's not always even necessarily relevant, because if somebody is saying something, in bad faith, in other words, like they're pretending that they care about something they don't really care about in order to serve some other agenda, like a sort of a really clear example of this might be somebody who's like a conservative or a libertarian, saying like, this or that left-wing thing that you support wouldn't actually, help
Medicare for all or whatever.
Yeah. It would actually be bad for the very people it's supposed to help because of this, that, or the other thing, right? Mm-hmm. And oftentimes this reaction, people after that critique, that I often have, right? Like that's very natural, I think, to have if you're on the left is, oh, for God's sake, right? Like that's not really what's making you tick here, right? Like you're not like, I do refuse to take seriously the idea that you're actually against the minimum wage because you're so concerned, about some people in the working poor, losing their jobs, as a result of it.
It's literally the first place your brain goes when that kind of an argument comes up. It's literally like every single time the brain goes there first, and you sort of like have to just keep composure almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
They just keep saying they're going to replace us with like robots that nobody likes.
Oh yeah, that's my favorite. If they make $15 an hour, the minimum wage or whatever, they just put a robot in. Like,
I've had 2 jobs in danger of automation, and they're both like really weird. Everybody's always like, "Oh man, like why learn to do that job real good? It'll just be done by robots in 20 years." And that's like, I hard refuse that.
Yeah. Well, it's also weird. It's also a weird thing to bring up, like in this context, because, like, do you actually believe that, like, if you accept like a little bit of a lower wage rate, that it's like, let's say the premise is true, right? That this job or that job really is going to be completely automated and just done by robots in however many years. I mean, do you really believe that there's some wage rate that we could accept as human beings that would be so low that we could win a race to the bottom against machines?
Right.
I doubt it. Right.
Why would I be accepting less money? I need to make more money. I need the big score, baby. Where's the big pizza score?
Yeah, well, especially you need that money if you're going to lose your job to automation in a few years anyway, right? You need to save up before that happens.
I need to make the big last heist that I can retire.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
like making tinier pizzas and selling them for less.
Right.
Or you can strike it out on your own and make your own damn pizzas.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Right. So I think it's like very natural that like this is like where your mind maybe goes first, and in that case, or at least a lot of cases, people say that, right? I think the judgment might even be correct, right? Like I think your suspicion that like, oh, this is really a rationalization for, this is really a rationalization for something that's really coming from a different place, right? Mm-hmm. Like oftentimes, yeah, it is, but that's not actually a good reason necessarily to say that you should just dismiss it and not engage with it. And one reason that it's not is that just because somebody has a bad motivation doesn't mean they're not going to persuade anybody.
Right.
That, and if you're concerned with stopping that,
buddy,
and
you just stepped on my Don Draper trap card, because that's constantly his idea on the show is just like come up with some like solution to why the people can't currently make money. Like, they build up Madison Square Garden. He's like, well, your big solution is to not care and act like you don't care. Because like responding to people saying you don't care is like fucking up all your money.
Well, real quick, let's pause for station ID. You listen to WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. We're talking about Don Draper now. We got Ben Burgis and Scott. No. We're talking about essentially engaging with arguments, even if the person is trying to persuade other people, taking them at least rhetorically at their word.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, like in a way, like this is a cheesy metaphor, right? But like. But think about like if you're an environmental lawyer and you're suing Monsanto, and like the lawyer for Monsanto comes up with some like legal argument that they use, it's like, okay, if you're in that position, it would clearly be true that they have a external motivation to make that argument. In fact, they're literally being paid by Monsanto to say that.
Right.
But that doesn't actually get you off the hook of having to come up with a response, right? Having to explain what's wrong with their legal argument.
You got to beat them.
If you want to win, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you want to beat them. Exactly. And so similarly, when you run into one of these right-wing arguments, then I think the reason, at least one reason why I do try to like take them seriously and engage with them, like even sometimes when they come in from completely ridiculous sources, right? So, for
Jordan
example,
Peterson comes to mind.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson, absolutely, right. Like I've written and spoken a bunch about him, and he's, I mean, like he is. Let's put it this way: that particular lobster is definitely missing some claws, right? Like that's like there's a lot that's wrong with the source. What's that?
He's been taking a lot of hits lately.
He has, and I feel bad, right? Like I think that he's really been through the rigor as a human being, but also he is a best-selling author who has a lot of like really politically bad ideas, that need to be responded to, right? So I do feel bad for what he's gone through, but
right.
but also I'm going to keep on pointing out why the things that he's told millions of people are true aren't, right?
Right. He still has influence,
and or even like more ridiculous than that, right? Like so. Well, Nathan Robinson, who's normally based in New Orleans, I think right now, maybe since the plague started,
he's in Florida, I believe, right now with his family.
Yeah, to be with his family.
Yeah, good friend of the show, Nathan Robinson. But you're going to engage with one of the things that he had been saying recently.
Yeah, well, and Nathan and I actually co-wrote a review of Glenn Beck's book "Arguing with Socialists" that's out in the new issue of Current Affairs. I like the new print issue. I think it's being mailed out in the next couple of weeks or something. But and the reason we did that, right? Even though like Beck is a deeply silly person who is not going to be convinced, by anything that we say, right? Like there's no scenario under which somebody mails that issue of Current Affairs to Glenn Beck and, it's like, oh, damn it, I was wrong, right? Now I need to endorse socialism. That's not going to happen, but it's important to be able to show exactly what's wrong with his argument because as much as we wish it were otherwise, right, there are lots of people who aren't necessarily unwinnable, right, who are going to take that stuff seriously, right? Maybe we don't think they should, but that doesn't mean they don't. And certainly...
I mean, there definitely is a case where, like the more of that happens, like the lower his status gets because like people aren't just like not challenging these ideas because like I mean I think starting next week they're gonna start broadcasting a show on like Home Shopping Network or something. Like he's like where is he even at? Is he too? It's not like the all-time Glenn Beck's like he was like prevalent in media for like 2 years.
Yeah, he's not prevalent in media anymore. He's definitely his career trajectory is definitely on a downward slope. But also, I think it's important that we have some sense of perspective about this, right? That yes, Glenn Beck is, thank the Lord, is not what he once was in terms of prominence. But I'd say that I'd like to know how many copies that Argue with Socialist book sold versus any book written by a socialist, but I actually don't want to know because it'd be too depressing, right? That I think even a past his peak Glenn Beck, right, is still reaching many more people.
I mean, it's kind of like the pundit you don't think about that's on like drive time conservative radio or something like that.
Well,
it's a guy kind of under the radar, also kind of just like forming his own rhetoric and like distributing it over the airwaves and stuff.
Right, and they have a system, and they have a bunch of people who will do. We're not giving them a platform by engaging with their argument, is what we're saying here. It sounds like
well that's also right. That's also something that people often worry about. Giving them a platform, and again, I think in cases like the Glenn Beck thing, it's particularly a misguided concern because somebody like Glenn Beck, somebody like Jordan Peterson, any of these people, they've already got bigger platforms than any of us do, right? Like Jordan Peterson, who you mentioned earlier, I've seen people say, oh, why are you still bothering like responding to him? Like his day is done, whatever. And then what I always do is I always show them the screenshot of Amazon's top 20 most purchased and read books of the last week, where, maybe it's not anymore, but up until very recently, it would, 12 Rules for Life would always be there. And it would say something like, 200th week on the list, it's like whatever it is, right? Like just because somebody isn't quite as culturally omnipresent, as they used to be, let's put it this way, not to put too fine a point on it, I think that I often find it pretty funny in a grim way when leftists who are right now this week reaching like 2% of the people that, Jordan Peterson or Glenn Beck are reaching and say, oh, why are you talking about those guys? Right. That like they don't matter anymore. It's like, okay, if they don't matter, then we really, really don't matter. Right. But I think the more important thing is also like, okay, like let's say, I think with somebody like, these reactionary figures like Beck or Peterson, you're primarily targeting not them, right? They're not going to come around. That's not going to happen, right? But you're primarily targeting the persuadable people who are currently listening to them. Mm-hmm. And also, especially when it's just like some random guy, right? That like, when it's like, I don't know, it's like your cousin on Facebook or something, or, more likely like your cousin's friend who you end up arguing with. So that's often how that happens. Just assuming, they're making what I see as this really disingenuous right-wing argument, therefore they're acting in bad faith, therefore fuck them, right. Whatever, bleep that out, I guess. But I don't know if you could say that on the radio here or not, but, therefore forget them. Like, it's just because somebody is repeating an argument, right? Like, doesn't mean that maybe even was originated in an insincere, disingenuous source, doesn't mean that they're being insincere about it. That clearly, that clearly doesn't follow. Mm-hmm. And so often in those cases, right, like even the person you're talking to, might, eventually come around, right? Most people aren't going to come around in the moment, right? That like, while they're actually arguing something, that's not a psychologically realistic idea of how persuasion works. Because, while you're in the middle of the, 50 comment thread or whatever, wait. Yeah. It's
like chemically impossible. It's like your brain literally has like you when you get angry, you start breathing short. You actually like you think differently, and that's and that's one of those sorts of things, right? Like that is not the time. You have to like cool down and then reflect on this sort of situation before you can even consider changing your mind.
Oh, totally, right? Like so that's not what's going to happen, but my problem is that people will often jump from the correct premise that people aren't going to change their mind, except for maybe very rare situations, while they're in the middle of arguing about something,
right,
to the incorrect conclusion that therefore they're not going to change their mind, right? Right. So first of all, if other people are reading it, right, like those are probably mostly who you're talking to anyway. Mm-hmm. Which is, worth keeping in mind. And I'm not saying I always take my own advice here, right? But like
we've all become corn cobs on the timeline. We know.
Yeah. All right. All of us, like he has never turned slowly into a corn cob, cast the first stone. Absolutely. But it doesn't even mean that guy's not going to change his mind, right? Like that's sure. Like while you're in the middle of it, too much of your ego is at stake, but that doesn't mean that the argument itself has no effect on you. Certainly when I reflect on times that I've changed my mind about things, right? It's almost never in the middle, right, of fighting with somebody about it. But what does happen is that, maybe a week or a month or a year later, right, you find yourself thinking back to the topic and you realize that you've changed your mind, mm-hmm. right? That like, because maybe something planted a seed and it kind of gnawed at you, or, like oftentimes, in fact, what I find really frustrated about this is that a lot of people on the left have absorbed this idea that's like, arguing with people who disagree politically is a waste of time because nobody ever changes their mind. And oftentimes, especially when I actually know the person who's making this, this claim, like, come on, dude, right? I know you, right? You grew up in like a conservative evangelical household. And then, you became an atheist when you started watching Richard Dawkins videos when you were a teenager, and then you were like a regular MSNBC Democrat until 2016, and you supported Bernie, and then you joined the DSA, and now you're like halfway to Maoism, and you're going to tell me that nobody ever changes their mind.
Right.
But like the crucial thing is, of course we all change our minds, right? Like if there's something very wrong with you if you never change your mind about anything. And we don't typically just change our minds randomly, right? We have reasons, right? That there's some consideration that now leads you to think something's true that didn't before. And some of that's about experience, but a lot of it's not, right? Like as much as I'd like to be, as much as it might be ideologically congenial for me to just be a hardcore materialist and say that people are always responding to mere material conditions, the obvious truth is that people often change their mind without changes in material conditions. Changes in material conditions, even when they do play a role, they can go in any number of different directions because people can draw wildly different political conclusions for the same changes in conditions.
People would be so much more predictable if that was the case. That if everyone was a functionally a Marxist, that would be so much more easy to organize people.
It would, right? But that's the whole problem, right? That's why there's a
superstructure.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like that's why capitalism has existed for hundreds of years and we're still living under it, because it's not that kind of automatic process. And so I think the more realistic thing that actually happens is you think about is that, somebody says something you don't like, right? Argue for some conclusion that you have a bad instinctive reaction to. You dismiss it, maybe even get angry about it in the moment, right? And then especially if you got into it with them a bunch, so they have a chance to say a bunch of more things that, that might get under your skin, then, much later, sometimes much later, right? Then like when you find yourself thinking about the issue, and again, you start to realize that some of the very considerations that you first dismissed now seem pretty powerful to you, right? Like after you kind of had a time to chew on them for a little while, right? Like, I mean, not that any of mine are like super interesting, right? But I mean, like I could certainly give you like several cases in my own life, right? When I've changed my mind about something in this way. And again, I think even a lot of the people that I know who are adamant that nobody changes their mind because of arguments have in fact very clearly changed their mind because of arguments. And I guess just to like maybe end by kind of looping back, right, to what your prompt, right? I think that that the reason to at least respond to things as if they were offered in good faith, which is not necessarily the same thing as not making a judgment about whether you think they were or not, right? Go ahead and do that, right? But the reason to respond to things as if you were talking to somebody who was sincerely found them persuasive and needed to have it explained to them, why it shouldn't be, is one, very often they are, right? Two, even if something seems ridiculous to you, even if it is ridiculous, that doesn't mean that nobody finds it persuasive. Again, if everybody was just a rational machine who was good at dismissing, bad arguments and accepting good arguments, we wouldn't be in nearly the hole that we're in right now. Right. And oftentimes somebody having this stuff taken seriously and having somebody engage with them about it actually is exactly what the doctor ordered as far as bringing them around. Also, even separately from you bringing them around, it's often very helpful, even just for yourself, even just to kind of get straight in your own head about what's true and why, to go through the exercise of explaining exactly what's wrong with the argument that we shouldn't have a higher minimum wage because then we'll all be replaced by robots or whatever it is. However much you have an instinctive, oh, that's ridiculous impulse. And even if that impulse is, as it is in that case, absolutely correct, right? It's still really useful to be able to explain, I think the way you've put it, Jeffrey, when we've talked about this before, is not just call it bullshit, but drill down into why it's bullshit.
Yeah, make them explain it. Make them go through the paces for what they're doing. Make them examine their own thinking, because sometimes when you're especially talking to your cousin or whatever, they haven't really put too much thought into it. And when and again, you might not change their mind in a moment or anything, but at least you can get them to examine what they're thinking and why they're thinking it. Yeah?
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. Mm-hmm. Right. And especially like if the way that you're responding to them is
like, oh, you're full of it.
Like, yeah, calling them an idiot, mm-hmm. Calling them, a bigot, calling them a dupe of, whatever. All those things might be true, right?
Right.
But also, that's exactly the response they're expecting. And in fact, it feeds into their sense of the state of play, right? Like that's what they expect, and it actually confirms their narrative, to respond that way, right?
They do it to trigger the libs, and then if you get triggered, then they win.
Yeah, exactly, right? That's the game for them, right? Like that's what reassures them that they're speaking hard truths and that you're just a hysteric who can't handle it. Uh-huh. Whereas if you can actually and again, maybe sometimes you can't, right? Like I'm not suggesting that anybody try to make themselves such a perfect person that they have it in them to respond this way all the time. And I don't think it's possible that you'd always that would always even be a good use of your time and energy. Mm-hmm. But right, when you can, taking what they're saying seriously, right? And if possible, talking to them like you think they're a person, and kind of actually making them run through those paces. There's no guarantee of success, but it's just one of these things where you can't win if you don't play. Mm-hmm. And if you just act as triggered as they want you to be, you're not playing.
Exactly. So thank you so much for joining us, Ben. Where can we find more information about what you're doing, some of your work? I know you're like we said at the top, you're a very busy guy. Where can we find more about what you're up to?
Sure. So it needs to be updated, but the easiest place to find the most of it is my website, which is just benburgis.com. So that's benburgis.com. And you can find there, for example, the columns that I write for Jacobin, and stuff that I write for other places. I mentioned the Third Rail, mm-hmm. Art Digital Media, and also I co-host with Adam Proctor and Brianna Last a podcast called The Dead Pundit Society, and I also have my own solo podcast, YouTube show called Give Them an Argument. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure actually when is this episode going to be aired?
This should come out on Tuesday, so a week from yesterday.
Tuesday. Okay, very good. So the one on Tuesday when people are listening to this, the episode of that just came out will be one with Gene Bajalan, Eric Levitz, Matt Crispin from Chapo Trap House, mm-hmm. and Megan Day from Jacobin. Mm-hmm. And then the one they can look forward to the next week is going to be Nathan Robinson in the first half, talking about that article that I mentioned and kind of using that as a launching pad to get into some of the other right-wing ghouls that he's written.
He's written about so many terrible people. I don't know how he does it. I don't have the stomach for it.
Yeah, and he'll do these 10,000 word articles about all of them. It's definitely a public service. And then in the second half of that, this might have to get delayed because of some family medical issues, but assuming that it doesn't, in the second half of that, I am going to be debating Yaron Brook from the Ayn Rand Institute. So I can look forward to that. You can find that youtube.com/Ben Burgis GTAA. So let's Give Them an Argument, or just look up Give Them an Argument on any of the standard podcast places.
Yeah, there's YouTube video, all that good stuff. And you've also done some work with Jacobin on their stay-at-home series as well, which has been really fantastic. You had a good video on this subject of Adolph Reed and that situation, as well as Jordan Peterson. So thank you so much for joining us, Ben. Really appreciate it. You can listen to Good Morning Comrade every Tuesday on WHIV-FM. You can also get more information on our website, goodmorningcomrade.com. You have been listening to Good Morning Comrade. This is WHIV-FM New Orleans.